telling a story that no one else has told. That's always the goal. Having the cooking background kind of gives me these extra tools, to kind of speak the languages that chefs can relate to. I know what it's like to be in a hot kitchen for 12 hours a day. I understand that there's this pocket in the afternoon that's the best time to reach a chef,
Mm-hmm.
Chefs are typically not morning people. By no means do I feel that I'm a chef with a capital C, but that I know enough about food that I can speak a similar language.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of That Can't Be Right. I am your host, Ryan Rogan. Today we're talking about food. I love food. I eat 3 times a day, but I also love Houston. And since I have been back in Houston, have really enjoyed exploring the food scene. And I think it's up there with any city in the United States. But we know I'm a proud Houstonian, so I'm bringing someone else along for the journey. But before we get into that, be sure to follow TCBR Pod on Twitter, Instagram, and now TikTok. What are we doing on TikTok? Posting videos of my weird facial expressions. That's all I got so far, but let's get into it. Today I'm joined by Bao Ong. Bao is a restaurant columnist for the Houston Chronicle. He previously worked on staff at Eater New York, Bon Appetit, and Time Out New York. While his background is in journalism, he also graduated from the French Culinary Institute, and he recently moved to Houston, so he doesn't have the long-standing bias that I do, so I'm really interested to get his perspective. Welcome, Bao, to That Can't Be Right.
Thanks so much. Besides being new to Houston, I'm also new to TikTok. I think I just signed up yesterday, and I'm also trying to put my face or voice or whatever you're supposed to do on TikTok. But
let me tell you a secret, because Bao and I have not met. We're doing this online. He was very gracious to respond to my email. I've had the greatest success on TikTok with my dog, being a complete menace. I don't know how to leverage that for a podcast or promoting content, but I'm excited to figure it out. Very low stakes.
But I think next to animals, food is probably like the next, is just as popular on TikTok. So you're on the right track.
For sure. So Bao, I just read your biography. Where's the best place to start in terms of like how you came to food journalism? You were a journalist, you went to the French Culinary Institute. How did you decide that was the path you wanted to go down?
I think everyone's path is a little different in the food media world. As an Asian American, I think my story is similar in terms of, the role that food played in my life growing up. We ate dinner together every meal. Like a lot of children of immigrants, I feel that, my parents, through food, that was the way they expressed, that was their love language. They didn't say, I love you, but they made sure, there was a hot meal 3 times a day. They took a lot of great care in the food that they prepared. So in that sense, food has always played a big role in my life. But how that turned into becoming a food journalist took a few different routes. I always enjoyed writing, and I felt like that was something that teachers kind of rewarded me growing up. So I decided to study journalism when I was in undergrad. And there was one summer, my first summer that I lived in New York, in Brooklyn, summer 2003. That's the summer that there was a blackout. It was very hot. But I was an unpaid intern. I was paying this girl $600 to basically sleep on this bench in her living room. Of course, I'm 21. This is great. I was in New York. I loved it. There wasn't even air conditioning in the apartment, I remember. But, she was also a journalist. She was in grad school at NYU, interning at the Daily News, also broke. And she was definitely a much better cook than me. And we started cooking together that summer. And I think that was the first time that I ever really enjoyed cooking. My parents did all the cooking at home, and, they would have us kids kind of help out, but I never really liked it. That summer in New York, though, was the first time that I really kind of started falling in love with cooking. And then that fall, I started interning at the St. Paul Pioneer Press, had a chance to work with the restaurant critic at the time. And that also opened up a new world to me. And, you can get paid to write about food. How do I get into this world? I started reading all the food writers and started, trying to figure out like, what is this world all about? But even before that, I think for me, being a journalist, first and foremost, is the most important part. It just happens to be that I love food and that's how I want to tell stories. I have this very strong belief that being a journalist, that's what I value the most. So I started, making sure that I had training as a news reporter. So I interned and then I took my first job, which was at the St. Paul Pioneer Press, covering news. So I was covering school boards, murders, floods, fires. It's not very glamorous compared to what you might think a food writer does, which is not always glamorous as well. I spent 2.5 years, being a news reporter because that was really important to me. And, one of my goals at that time was to write for the New York Times or be on staff at the New York Times. So I just knew that they valued having people who were strong journalists. So I quit my job after 2.5 years. I was like, okay, put in my time there, moved to New York, didn't have a job. So I enrolled in culinary school because I was too junior to get into a place like the New York Times, but I also had too much experience for entry-level jobs at a big magazine, for example.
Gotcha.
So I said, okay, let's go to culinary school. I love to cook. A lot of people who, I get emails, DMs from a lot of students who are like, oh, do I need to go to culinary school to be a food writer? So I'll just answer that right now. No. It was a great experience. I loved it. I made some of the best friends that I'm still very close to today. But I never had this idea of becoming a chef full time. That's probably like one job that would make it more impossible to pay your rent in New York. But during that time in culinary school, though, I started blogging for a woman who had one of the first big food blogs at the time called The Strong Buzz. She launched at the same time that Eater and Grub Street, which New York Magazine owns. They were all kind of in this like very competitive blogging space in the early aughts. I was doing it for free, but it gave me a chance to learn about New York City restaurants, make a lot of contacts. I also applied to be an intern for Gail Green. She was a longtime restaurant critic for New York Magazine, this legendary figure in food media. I worked for her and, for a few years as well. But when I finished culinary school, which is only 9 months long, the economy was shitty. It's 2009. So I enrolled in grad school just to kind of buy myself some time, kind of hide from the job market. I stayed in New York, went to Columbia, got this MA in arts and culture journalism. That opened the door for me to the New York Times, but on the Metro desk, so again, I say, okay, if I can get my foot in the door at the New York Times, you can literally ask me to like write about paint drying on the wall and I will do it. Again, so I was going out to all 5 boroughs, covering breaking news, just trying to, get better as a journalist. And I met David Carr, who was the media columnist at the time, and he actually also went to the same undergrad as me, the University of Minnesota. Met him, and and this is a tale that so many people tell about David Carr, is that he's just so generous with his time. So I met with him, grab a coffee type of meeting, and like so many journalists have shared similar stories about David Carr. He's so giving and he's so generous and supportive of young journalists. He introduced me to Sam Sifton, who was the restaurant critic at the New York Times for I think 5 years or so. Anyhow, Sam and I met, we hit it off, and he said, you need to extend your internship here in the dining section. So that opened that door up for me, and I started, reporting there as an intern, and that kind of morphed into a steady freelance gig. I had this column that ran for about 3 years online, just covering like food events. I'm learning a lot about the city, getting my byline out there, and that really helped me kind of launch a freelance career. I probably a good 5 years freelancing before I went on staff. First, it was like Bon Appetit, which was a great place to be at. Although, I think I was a bit underemployed, if we want to put it that way. And then I went to Time Out New York, which was, it was an interesting move because I went from a national publication with tons of brand recognition to a smaller publication, although like very well known in New York, but it was very much a New York thing.
Right.
But I had a bigger role and I was able to do a lot more. And I think that helped me land the job as the editor of Eater New York, which I joined during the middle of the pandemic. Well, that was an interesting time to join. Eater was a great place in terms of being a fit for me as someone that's very interested in news and journalism. But I think also the pandemic really kind of helped shape or change my relationship with New York, like it did for a lot of people. And then when this door opened up in Houston, I said, why not? It was like one of the cities that I kind of had my eye on in terms of the next step to New York. And so far, it's been great. I love it here. The food is amazing, and I've only scratched the surface of it.
Thank you for sharing all of that context. Your story is very exciting. I think you touched on a few really cool things I'll dive a little deeper into. First, you mentioned Minnesota, and I did see that in your bio. Hot dish. How often do you eat that? How often does it come up in your work? I visited Minnesota in 2018 and learned it was a thing. Is it something that needs to extend beyond Minnesota as a cuisine?
For anyone that isn't familiar with hot dish, it's basically what Minnesotans call, casserole, a baked casserole dish. I did not grow up eating hot dish because at home we ate almost exclusively Vietnamese food. My mom did all the cooking for the most part. I don't remember the first time I tried it. There's always this kind of fascination with all these foods that I didn't have a chance eating growing up, like Chef Boyardee, Kraft mac and cheese. I love that stuff. Like that's like my junk food.
Right.
I didn't even get to eat, instant ramen really. And the same with hot dish. So it's like something I love. I've made hot dish on my own before. I don't remember the last time it was, but it's very nostalgic. That's for sure.
Okay. So we've covered hot dish, Minnesota national dish, but I also want to kind of dive into your experience growing up. You said your parents spoke Vietnamese, cooked Vietnamese food. Did they pass on the traditions? I know you said you didn't really help when you were a child, but like as you went to culinary school, as you struck out on your own, did you ever call your mom and be like, hey, how do I make my favorite thing that you used to make frequently? And did she give you very vague, terrible instructions like my mom does when I ask for advice?
Her definition of a cup of sugar, seems to change from recipe to recipe. And yes, I do. I feel especially, as my parents are getting older, I'm getting older, I've made it a point to try to learn some of these recipes. There's nothing like home cooking from your parents, and those are like recipes that you don't want to lose. Whenever I'm visiting home or my mother was just here in Houston for a few weeks and, I had her make some of my dishes that are still sitting in my freezer, and I'm sure I'll finish it off soon enough. There is that, kind of typical experience of trying to tease out these recipes from your parents, and there aren't really instructions.
Very interesting experience, but I'm glad it seems like it's pretty universal. One other question I want to ask about your very interesting background before we jump onto the food industry generally is how writing about food compares to some of the other things you wrote about. You mentioned kind of being on the Metro beat, covering news, floods, fires, crimes. How does it to you compare, especially with your background from the Culinary Institute?
I'm always trying to find this sweet spot of where I feel that I'm doing my due diligence as a reporter and being as thorough as possible and telling a story that no one else has told. That's always the goal. Having the cooking background kind of gives me these extra tools, to kind of speak the languages that chefs can relate to. I know what it's like to be in a hot kitchen for 12 hours a day. I understand that there's this pocket in the afternoon that's the best time to reach a chef, Mm-hmm. Chefs are typically not morning people. They tend to be night people. They're working long hours, they're not available on a lot of holidays. It might be little things like that when I'm trying to chase down a source. Or I can talk about food things that I think chefs geek out a lot about, whether it's the XYZ awards that were just announced or the popular restaurant that everyone is talking about in the moment. That cooking knowledge, and by no means do I feel that I'm a chef with a capital C, but that I know enough about food that I can speak a similar language to a lot of these chefs and people that work in the food world that I end up interviewing a lot for stories. So it's just trying to I think a lot of food journalism, a lot of food content out there doesn't necessarily always push the boundaries of reporting, has a reputation for being a little bit soft or a little bit cheerleading at times. And I want to bring some of that training as a journalist into my food writing.
That's exciting. It segues nicely into what I want to ask about next is just we've talked about TikTok, how it is food content friendly, but maybe not critical or a very in-depth exploration. How do you think social media has impacted food criticism, like the items on menus that are specifically to be photographed, or you have someone like Salt Bae, where it's a very Instagrammable experience? Over the course of your career, how has that, do you think, influenced the industry?
I think social media has been great for the food world. It's helped drive this infatuation with food that's across our culture, not even just American culture, but globally, whether it's someone in Korea that's popularized, the trend of the mukbang, people eating, recording themselves eating. That's popular on social media. Or people traveling to whichever country and documenting their food experiences. Social media has really helped sustain this interest in food, which is giving people like me jobs. I think the job is changing because so much content is free. It's all free on social media,
right?
Which has affected old school media, specifically newspapers and magazines. But it's also forced us to be creative and to break out of old conventions of reporting stories. On the flip side, it's posed challenges for critics. I think most people would agree that kind of a dying breed of journalists out there, the kind of that critic who gets to hand out all these stars. It's a lot more democratic now. The question is, how much do we value having a critic and having a platform like TikTok where someone can basically fart on TikTok and have 2 million views or something like that. Overall, though, I think social media has really helped food media as an industry. And, it's not just writing about the restaurants that have expensive PR teams. A small food truck run by a family can go on Instagram and document their whole business that way. And maybe 20 years ago, I wouldn't have, had discovered that business if it weren't for a tool like Instagram, for example.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I want to follow up on one thing you mentioned about it has maybe democratized access to food in a sense. Could you pinpoint to a specific reason for that or a specific moment when you feel like that shifted?
The rise of social media has changed the role of the handful of food media outlets that used to be considered, what people would say were the tastemakers. The idea of a tastemaker has changed. It's no longer the 5 top editors at a big national magazine or just the New York Times critic. Now you have people who make a living off as an influencer, or people who just go viral because of one TikTok and spark a different trend. Yelp also changed the landscape. I think more about pinpointing a moment, but I think it is about how this shift in who gets to essentially be a tastemaker.
My mind immediately, went to, I worked at Yelp briefly. I was terrible at it, but it was interesting to see. I mean, it's these people's livelihood, so it very much makes sense that they're passionate about it and didn't like how Yelp came into the space. 2, I immediately thought of Keith Lee, who has risen over the last few weeks with his brief reviews that he started doing as a way to battle social anxiety. But 3, I'm thinking of a trend I dislike on social media, and I want to know if there are any that you dislike. I'll share mine first. I don't like this idea that we can put macaroni and cheese on anything. I've seen macaroni and cheese on a burger. I've seen a brisket macaroni and cheese sandwich where instead of buns, you have brisket with macaroni and cheese in the middle, macaroni and cheese on a Chick-fil-A sandwich. I like macaroni and cheese. I enjoy it. But I don't like this trend of seeing it everywhere. And that's a very me thing. Are there any TikTok trends that make you cringe?
The butterboard. Yeah, I love butter.
Same.
I don't need it spread on a wooden board. And now I think there's this TikTok trend of like people making like butter candles.
Also, I've seen, not interested. Because
Yeah.
I don't know how long that stays like enjoyable unless
Yeah.
you're out of like a igloo bar or something.
Yeah, it's I just saw it today, so I don't even know what it is, but it's not appetizing to me.
There we go. And, there's something out there for everybody, but there's also things we're not going to like. And that's fine. That's totally fine.
Yeah, it's when it becomes these like TikTok trends, Instagram trends, like they basically become ways to create viral content versus actual food that you would want to eat. Is like, I think when it crosses the line.
I agree. I also don't like the ones that waste a lot of food. That's always kind of upsetting to me. But again, there are people that are out there that are creating content that hopefully like avoid some of those things that bother you, bother me, bother anybody listening. And I hope we continue to find it. The last thing, actually, let's just jump right into it. I reached out to you because I think Houston is a food city. I think everybody's like, Chicago's the best food city, New York's the best food city, the Bay, whatever. I think Houston's up there, can go toe to toe with any of those cities because of the diversity of food, the quality of food. It's kind of spread out, as I'm sure you're learning after years in New York. But from your perspective, what makes a city a good food city? Are there specific characteristics you think?
Yeah, what makes a food city? To me, it's, a city that, can kind of create identity around food in a way, whether it's like one specific dish. It doesn't have to be a city like New York where there are, lots of fine dining restaurants and like a great amount of diversity. That's wonderful, but I don't think that's like the definition of what a good food city is. For example, I love Providence, Rhode Island. Obviously it's small, but they do have a culinary school that's very popular there. So I think that's helped kind of create this like pool of talent that exists there. I would travel, and I think a lot of people travel for food these days. Like I would travel to Maine to get a lobster roll. I would travel to New Orleans if I wanted a specific Cajun dish or a certain experience. I want stone crabs when I go to Florida, if I go to Miami or I'm somewhere in Florida. So I think it's like places that are able to preserve their identity through whether it's a dish or a certain type of cuisine makes it a good city. If it's just all the same chain restaurants that you can find anywhere else, I don't know why I would go to that spot, whether it's on the coast or in the middle of the country. I'm trying to think, I was actually born in Iowa. But like in Iowa, there are certain cities where like they serve this like certain kind of pork chop. That's their thing.
Yep.
I want to eat that good pork chop, or I want to, go to the Bourbon Trail in Kentucky. They've kind of like created this like industry around bourbon ever since like bourbon started getting popular in the last decade or so. Mm-hmm. So it's like having this like preserving this identity of like what's like local to that particular city will set it apart. I think Houston does a good job in terms of like because it is so diverse. I think someone told me Vietnamese is the third most spoken language in the state after English and Spanish. And in Houston, you have some of the best Vietnamese food in the country. And I think you could objectively argue that some of it's better than what you would find in parts of Vietnam. I haven't done enough like research in this area, but like I know there's a huge Nigerian population. I should be experiencing this more. I should be writing about it more. And we just published a taco guide. Like tacos is just like one aspect of what's available in Houston. And that's what I love about Houston is because of all this like range in food that you can experience within. You have to drive there, but you can find pretty much anything you want in Houston if you're willing to kind of do a little bit of research and do a little bit of driving.
Agreed. And I love that framing, like areas that are preserving their identity through food. And it doesn't have to be necessarily like a wide range of food. It can be something that they do very well. I also want to ask a very specific question related to one of your responses. Lobster rolls, do you prefer them served warm or cold? If you have a preference.
The thing is, like, I never really crave a lobster roll. I lived in New York for 14 years. So, maybe once a year, I would kind of crave a lobster roll because it really felt like, oh, like summer is here finally. But, I'd much rather have like a clam roll. I think they're better than lobster rolls. But between a hot and cold one, maybe cold, but on a hot bun.
I like it. I like it.
Toasted, buttered, hot bun. Yeah, with some cold lobster.
I think that's another thing that's happened with social media. People feel like they have to choose something, and I'm guilty of it, as indicated by my question. But you don't. That's why I tried to preface it by saying ended the question by saying you don't have to have a preference. But I appreciate the answer. I want to turn to an article you published recently in the Houston Chronicle about how 1 year kind of changed Houston's dining scene. I think it was 2012. Could you tell us a little bit about what you think happened in 2012, or kind of spotlight some of those restaurants and those chefs that you think kind of created that inflection point for the Houston dining scene?
My first visit to Houston was 2013. So, about a year after these restaurants that I wrote about opened in 2012. So those 4 restaurants are, so Pass and Provisions is actually technically 2 restaurants that shared a space. One was more definitely like fine dining. The other was like a little more casual. Underbelly, which was Chris Shepard's first restaurant. And obviously he's become a big name nationally. Now as a kind of ambassador of Houston, but also with his Southern Smoke Foundation nonprofit. Justin Yu opened his restaurant Oxheart. That space has become Theodore Rex through the years. And then Uchi was the 4th one, which is still going very strong today. But yeah, I feel like that was kind of the year that Houston was receiving all this like national attention. It was also leading up to the first time that a Houston chef had won like a James Beard Award, and that hadn't happened since like the 80s or something like that. But it was just this time where there was just so much excitement happening on the Houston dining scene. Not only was there attention from national media outlets, but I think you could fairly say that, locally people were very excited by what was going on. Allison Cook, who is the restaurant critic at the Houston Chronicle, she's never given more 4 stars in 1 year than she did in 2012. And I think that just really speaks to the caliber of what was happening in Houston that year. And it's just kind of growing since then, like Chris Shepard went on to open more restaurants and do big things. And, like Uchi is still going strong. It's still packed to this day if you go. And the Pass and Provision, they really help kind of change kind of these notions of fine dining in Houston, which felt very kind of, based on like my research and a little bit of experience so far, like it kind of felt kind of dated, or like, there was certain expectations of fine dining that you would find at some of the old school places that are still open in Houston, but really kind of carved this path for a younger generation of chefs who wanted to present fine dining in a different way. And Justin Yu also helped move the needle on that front.
And that was like when I wasn't in Houston during that time. So I feel like I missed a lot of it. So I think I spoke to you before we hit record that coming back to Houston, coming closer to the city center where some of these places are, has been really exciting to see. Like they have kind of advanced notion of what like fine dining or like a different dining experience are. Want to shift to your experiences specifically in Houston. You mentioned you had come in 2013 when you made the decision to move here. What were your expectations in coming to Houston and making the decision to take this role?
I had been visiting Houston. I probably had been here like half a dozen times between my first visit in 2013 and then when I moved here in July. I felt that the dining scene here had improved every visit that, I made. It just got better and better. And for some reason, I kind of felt very confident this type of trend would keep happening. In terms of like, I feel like being a dynamic food city, I felt that, okay, this can only keep growing because, based on, in New York, I feel that as great as it is, I think it's very hard to open a restaurant in New York. And I think that really affects what works. And like, a lot of the trendy restaurants, they're all very similar to me. I was kind of getting bored, like it's hard to be creative or to take risks in New York when the stakes are so high, whether we're literally talking about the rent or the media coverage that so many chefs and restaurants want. Where I think that's less of an issue here because, the rents, although definitely increasing, it's more affordable. If you want to open a restaurant here in Houston, you don't have to take on a dozen investors and please all those investors and turn a profit right away in that first year or two. So you see, young chefs experimenting and doing pop-ups and, opening their own concepts that they wouldn't necessarily been able to do in a city like San Francisco or Chicago, New York. So I feel like Houston being a place where I think young chefs could thrive was a big part of it. And then I'm half Vietnamese, half Chinese. Vietnamese food is my comfort food. And there's just so much of it here. In some ways, like my first meal here in Houston was a bowl of pho that first day that I landed in July. It's hot. It was the hottest July on record, but it did not stop me from having pho for my first meal. And I wouldn't have had it any other way. And also and I don't think I realized how diverse the city was, but I kind of knew there was a lot of things that I still needed to discover, but I didn't really realize how diverse Houston is. Mm-hmm. And I think that's constant. The same reason what drew me to New York, this constant feeling of being inspired and that, every corner you turn is a little bit new. So, except now it's just a little bit different. I have to find it in a strip mall maybe, which in some ways I think is actually more exciting than finding a new spot in New York because everyone kind of knows everything, it's just the footprint is much smaller. Mm-hmm. There's so much more coverage that you're not very likely to be the only person to know about a place. Where there's so much ground to cover here in Houston, I get that excitement when I find a place that hasn't been written about or that, a few people know about that hasn't been written up somewhere. To me, that's more exciting than, finding the next hot restaurant in New York.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I hadn't considered, as someone who doesn't know a ton about the restaurant industry, what you were saying about having all these different investors, needing all these different investors if you're opening somewhere else is not something I had considered. But something I also wanted to ask you about is pop-ups. There are a lot of Houston restaurants. Well, I don't want to over-exaggerate, but I feel like a lot of restaurants are starting as pop-ups, doing events on weekly, monthly, whatever type basis, and then they're turning into brick and mortars. Is that a trend in New York as well?
Pop-ups were a more affordable way to kind of deal with all the challenges that the pandemic posed, especially in the early days in New York. Some of these pop-ups were very takeout friendly. I wrote about a young woman who baked babka out of her apartment, sold it, and there was someone selling jars of pickles from their apartment and handing it through some kind of little pulley system from her apartment. It just really allowed people to be very creative. And some of these pop-up concepts have moved to brick and mortar locations. But I think also the pandemic and other events happening within the last 3 years now also really kind of changed the restaurant industry in terms of people have been taking a harder look at what working conditions should be about pay and how people are treated in the restaurant industry. These are all issues that are not new to the restaurant industry and have had, people had been talking about them through the years, but it definitely became a bigger issue during the pandemic. And I think the format of a pop-up addresses some of those issues in terms of letting people have ownership of their business. I just worked on a story. She was a finalist for Top Chef and she's from Houston. She cooked in New York for a long time. And after Top Chef ended, this is the last season, Evelyn Garcia is her name. She did a number of pop-ups with her business partner. And, it was a way to kind of drum up support and buzz for this restaurant that she had already been planning to open. But it's also a way for her to be in the community to, bring her cooking to different parts of the community where she was doing pop-ups. And they were telling me that, once they get going, they want to come back to the farmers markets and do these pop-ups because they're a little bit more accessible too. Not everyone has the money or the time to sit down for an hour or two or, spend a sit down restaurant meal, but they can swing by a pop-up. I'm kind of curious to see if there'll be a long, term trend versus if it's, something that will kind of eventually phase out.
I've enjoyed them because it is like an opportunity to get exposed to things you might not have the time for or know about yet if you're not super plugged into like the restaurant scene or anything like that. So excited to check out that article. I thought I had read everything, but you snuck one past me. That's a lot about Houston. I want to ask a couple other questions about like Houston specific cuisine. Also, proud of you for eating a bowl of pho in July as soon as you landed because that tastes good. Would have been a little warm. Have you had kolaches?
I have.
Okay.
I need to eat more.
Agreed. Can't go wrong.
Yeah. I remember on a road trip to Austin, I remember stopping at a place, but I can't remember the name. But locally, the like kolache shop here is really good. I have a lot more kolache eating to do.
Yes. For those who aren't familiar, kolaches are almost like, at the very basic version, almost like a pig in a blanket with kind of a sweet roll. But in Houston, especially again, since I've been back, people have gotten really creative with them. You can get them with boudin, you can get them with venison, you can get them with, there's a restaurant in Houston called Burger Chan that did like a cheeseburger kolache that was really good. Lots of different great options.
Cafeteria, which is in East Downtown, Edo, I guess. They're a kind of coffee/pastry shop, and they do like fun versions too of like kolaches and like other pastries.
I'll share my favorites, of course. That'll be some good TikTok content for us. But want to kind of jump in before we get maybe a few recommendations for you for someone exploring Houston for the first time. Are there any, kind of want to, maybe some spicy questions potentially. You don't have to name names, of course, but are there any ingredients or experiences at restaurants that you have found to be not worth it or otherwise overrated?
There's this trend of these very kind of over the top, somewhat clubby restaurants. They tend to be very pricey. It's a night, definitely a night out. It's entertainment. I'm a little suspicious. I admit that. I haven't been because it's just kind of not my style, but I think there's an audience for it. Those are kind of the spots that I don't feel, it's definitely a part of Houston, but I don't feel like that's what sets the Houston dining scene apart. For me, what sets Houston apart is in Asia Town, like Kim Sun is like this place that generations of Vietnamese families and Asian families have thrown their weddings. That's known as a banquet hall, like the buffet is like pretty epic. It's not, it's not fine dining food. It's not, not everything is perfect by any means. Someone told me that one of the reasons they wanted to open this buffet was the family wanted a place that older Vietnamese people in the community could afford a place to buy lunch. There's one particular shop that sells this certain type of Vietnamese meatloaf that people like to buy for Lunar New Year. It's that, or stories like, Chris Williams at Lucille's, what he's doing to preserve family recipes in many ways that never really got recognition. I wrote a story not too long ago. There was a woman, she started a business, she calls it Black Girl Tamales. I think like those type of entrepreneurs, the people who are doing that type of cooking are the people that are really kind of like setting Houston apart, or like, it's what makes Houston special in my mind. It's not these kind of like over the top clubby restaurants that we'll bring sparklers around to the table and have people dancing and hanging from the, ceiling. It's these like smaller spots that have been like a platform for like so many small businesses that I think stand out the most for me.
I love it. I love how much you've already like adopted the city and know so much about it. Like you've been here. Obviously it's your job, but I'm excited that you've mentioned places I've been to. I love like Drive by Kim Sun. I'm like, yep, been there. Love it. Great food. But it's interesting to know, like part of the reason they wanted to start was to create a space for like Vietnamese people to be able to go get like an affordable lunch. And you don't always get to hear the backstory on places. So thank you for sharing. Last thing I want to get into before we wrap, if someone who was interested in coming to Houston for 2 to 3 days, what restaurants, or if you don't want to name specific restaurants, what cuisines would you point them to? Or dishes, whatever you're thinking.
A good friend of mine, she lives in New York. She kind of works in kind of like the wine space. So definitely the food world. she's visiting this weekend, so I can just tell you like where we're going.
Ooh, perfect.
She goes, yeah. So so I've been doing dry January, and have like kept that streak up in today's February 3rd, I guess?
Yes.
But I'm going to break that streak with her. We're going to Light Years. It's this house that's like a wine bar, but also a wine shop. They specialize a lot in natural wine, which I think is kind of surprising. I don't think people think of Houston as a place where you can find natural wine, because people think of it as a steak town where you want those big California reds, very kind of like old school, more traditional wines. So we're going there. Then we have a dinner planned at Indianola, which I haven't been to, but definitely a little bit trendier. Just kind of something that I think like might impress her. Like, hey, we're not, Houston's not this like small little town. It's the fourth largest city in the country.
Yes.
We have like cool things too. So there, and then we have a number of great cocktail bars in the city. Like Julep won the James Beard Award last year. Anvil in Montrose has been around. I think that would really kind of set the bar in terms of kind of craft cocktails in Houston, but they opened a spot above Anvil called Refuge.
Okay.
So we'll try to get into one of those spots for a nightcap. There's so much good barbecue here, obviously. So we're still trying to figure out which barbecue spot to go to tomorrow. We have to fit in a little bit of Tex-Mex. We're going to skirt the whole Ninfas versus El Tiempo debate. I think we're going to try Armando's, kind of go old school, a little bit fancier, but I haven't been there, so we might as well kind of give it a try. We'll fit in a snack somewhere in Asia Towns to make sure that she tries some Vietnamese food here because it's so amazing.
Yep.
And then before she leaves Sunday, probably get a taco in.
That sounds like a good weekend.
Yeah.
You're a great host. That sounds like a great weekend.
It's like 3 cheat days in a row for me. So
I know.
That's fair.
I know. But Bao, that's it. Thank you so much. I'm so excited you came to Houston. You're writing for Houston Chronicle. It's been fun reading your articles. It's been fun following your journey like through the city. I feel like you're such a great ambassador for the city. I know I kind of mentioned that already, but it feels like diving into it, you're exploring it, you're learning the history of these businesses, which is so important for people to develop relationships and context around the food they're eating. So again, I thank you. I thank you for joining me. Before we go, where can people find you on the internet if you want to be found?
Obviously, all my stories for the Houston Chronicle are at houstonchronicle.com. I think I've tried to quit Twitter.
I feel you.
But still going on Instagram, Bauhaus, that's Baohaus. So I try to keep people in the loop that way. Just started TikTok, but I don't even know where that's going yet. There'll be something new by the time the podcast gets published, I'm sure. Like some new platform.
Yeah, you have all weekend to maybe capture some content. So, and it's more fun with a friend, I'm sure. So, Bao, thank you so much for joining me. Can't wait to use your work to build my to-do list of eating in Houston.
Yeah, well, let's grab a meal sometime. So